I'm Ilya Soman, professor of law at George Mason University. Constitutional structure is vital to protecting liberty. Constitutions and the institutions that they set up affect liberty in a number of important ways, including by limiting the powers of political leaders and also those of the voters. In a democratic society, both can potentially threaten liberty in very significant ways. We're going to talk about three different ways in which constitutionalism affects liberty. First, the trade-off between a separation of powers system and a parliamentary system. Second, the trade-off between federalism and a unitary state. And finally, the institution of judicial review. In a separation of powers system like that in the United States, the executive power is held by a president who is elected separately from the legislature. By contrast, in a parliamentary system like the one in Canada or in many European countries, the executive comes from within the legislature. That executive power is held by a prime minister and his or her cabinet, who are chosen from within the legislature. Usually the prime minister is just the leader of the largest party in the legislature or of the ruling coalition. Both types of systems have their own advantages and disadvantages. In a separation of powers system, there are checks and balances. A president can check the legislature and vice versa, and that can protect liberty in important ways because each can constrain the other. In addition, a lot of evidence suggests that separation of powers systems have less government spending than parliamentary systems do, and that also limits their encroachment on liberty and property rights. However, parliamentary systems have advantages of their own. One is that there is less concentration of power in the hands of a single person. A prime minister, generally speaking, is easier to remove and constrain than a president is. In addition, many scholars argue that in a parliamentary system, there is less danger of collapse into dictatorship than in a presidential system, and that this has happened less often in a parliamentary system historically. The next trade-off to look at is that between federalism and a unitary state. In a federal system like in the United States or Canada or Germany, there are multiple levels of government, and the central government shares power with regional governments such as states in the US. Federalism has important advantages for liberty. One is that people can vote with their feet by moving from one jurisdiction to another, and thereby potentially escaping harmful or oppressive policies. Also, a federal system can leave more room for diversity than a unitary system can, because there are variations in policy between different regions. People with different preferences can more easily have them satisfied than in a unitary system where there are more one-size-fits-all central government policies. However, federalism has potential shortcomings as well. The most obvious one historically is the danger of oppression of local minorities by regional governments. A famous example is that of African Americans in the era of segregation in the United States. Also, the fiscal arrangements of a federal system are very important to get right. If the central government heavily subsidizes regional and local governments, then those subnational governments often tend to overspend and also have very little incentive to adopt good economic policies that promote growth. So for federalism to work best, we need to have strict limits on the subsidization of local and regional governments by the central government. The last institution to talk about is that of judicial review. In a system like we have in the US and in many other liberal democracies, judicial review enables independent judges to strike down laws and regulations adopted by the legislature and by the executive branch. That can protect liberty in a number of important ways. The most obvious is by protecting individual rights, such as freedom of speech or the right to property that the other branches of government might violate. In addition, judicial review can help impose and enforce structural constraints on the power of the executive and the legislature, for instance, by preventing them from encroaching on the authority of subnational governments or undermining separation of powers in a presidential system. And these structural constraints can also protect liberty in the ways that I already discussed earlier. However, while judicial review is extremely useful, we shouldn't overstate its effectiveness. Judges function within political constraints, and often it's difficult or impossible for them to oppose the will of the political majority too much or oppose the dictates of other branches of government. Judicial review is useful, but it is no panacea. Ultimately, there may not be any one constitutional system that is best for all countries. The optimal solution will vary depending on the situation. But constitutional constraints on government power are an essential element of protecting liberty.